They called Thaddeus the man who never blinked. In back rooms thick with smoke and fear, grown men forgot how to breathe when he walked in. He ruled without shouting, punished without mercy, and left silence where others left blood. Power bent to him. Loyalty feared him. Compassion had no place in his world. Until a hospital corridor stopped him cold.
No guns, no threats, no leverie.
Just the sound of a child crying. Behind glass and blinking machines lay a boy too small for the weight pressing on his chest. 17 surgeons already defeated, hope running thin. In that sterile room, Thaddeus discovered something no rival had ever shown him. Power meant nothing here. Fear meant nothing. Money meant nothing. For the first time in decades, he couldn't command the outcome. He could only stay. As the boy fought for every breath, the man who had built an empire on control was forced into a war he didn't know how to win. A war against helplessness, against guilt, against the life he had chosen to live. This is not a story about miracles alone. It's about what happens when a monster meets innocence and learns that redemption doesn't come through dominance, but through presence. If you're hooked, stay with me till the very end of the story. Don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe button, drop a comment, and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. I've got so many incredible stories coming your way, and you definitely don't want to miss any of them. Alright, let's get back to the story. Thaddeus moved through the dimly lit back room with the ease of a predator, each step measured, deliberate. The air smelled of expensive cigars and cold leather, the faint tang of gunmetal lingering just beneath it. Around him, men shifted uneasily, their fear palpable. It wasn't the gun at his hip or the knife tucked beneath his coat. They were weapons, yes, but his presence alone carried the kind of authority that made men's blood run cold. No one dared question him. Not here, not anywhere. When Thaddeus spoke, even the loudest of voices fell silent, swallowed by the gravity of his calm, unyielding glare. Tonight's meeting had been a simple one, yet tension had built as if the room itself knew the stakes. Business matters, nothing violent, and yet every man present felt the shadow of his reputation pressing down. He listened with a measured patience, his dark eyes scanning faces, weighing loyalty and deceit with a subtle tilt of his head. When a subordinate stammered, trying to justify a mistake, Thaddeus didn't shout, didn't slam a fist, didn't even raise his voice. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, and that alone froze the man in place. His silence was a weapon more precise than any blade. A bead of sweat ran down the subordinate's temple. He swallowed, forced words out, hoping to survive the scrutiny of the man who never blinked. Once the meeting concluded, Thaddeus left without a word of farewell, the men behind him exhaling as though released from some invisible cage. Outside, the night was cold and still, the city's usual chaos muted under the blanket of fear and respect his name carried. He stepped into his car, black and armored. The engines purr low, obedient growl. The streetlights reflected on the polished metal as he drove, thoughts already shifting to the next matter of business, the next obligation, the next calculation of risk and reward. Emotion was a foreign language to him. Empathy, compassion, words he had long since buried beneath layers of control and necessity. Yet, as he approached St. Michael's Hospital, a peculiar unease began to creep in, subtle but insistent. The sterile glow of the building cut sharply against the night, a stark contrast to the shadows and smoke of his world. Here, power meant nothing, and that realization, though quiet, stirred something he couldn't identify. Parking at the curb, he stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete, the familiar weight of the gun at his side offering no comfort in this place. Nurses and visitors passed, oblivious to the force standing among them. For the first time in decades, Thaddeus felt a trace of displacement, a crack in the armor of his certainty. He moved toward the hospital doors, not for business, not for leverage, but because something about this sterile, quiet place whispered that the rules here were different, and that even a man who never blinked could be forced to notice what he had always ignored. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and quiet desperation, a stark contrast to the heavy smoke and metallic tang of Thaddeus's usual haunts. He walked the long, narrow corridor with purpose, though purpose here meant little. No one feared him in this world of blinking monitors and hurried nurses. The faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead was almost comforting in its monotony, until it was pierced by a sound that froze him mid-step, a small, fragile wail, high-pitched and ragged, yet impossibly persistent. It was a sound so human, so unbearably pure, that it seemed to cut through the armor he had spent a lifetime forging. He stopped, instinct telling him to move on, to ignore it, to let the professionals handle what he could not. But the cry lingered, tugging at some memory or feeling he thought he had long buried. Against his every instinct, he followed it, the polished floor reflecting his long shadow like a silent warning. The nurses hurried past, their movements precise, rehearsed, practiced, carrying the weight of resignation more than hope. And there, behind a glass window, he saw him. Hawthorne was smaller than Thaddeus expected, frail, tangled in tubes and wires that blinked and hissed with a mechanical insistence. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his tiny hands grasping at nothing, reaching toward a mother whose tears fell freely, her body trembling with helplessness. The child's cry was raw, guttural, a sound that no power or wealth could silence. For a moment, Thaddeus's world, the one built on control, fear, and meticulous calculation, seemed irrelevant. All of his authority, all of his carefully constructed dominance, meant nothing here. A nurse glanced at him, startled, and murmured softly, 17 surgeons, 17. They said there's nothing more we can do. The words landed like stones in his chest, heavier than any gun, sharper than any blade he had ever wielded. He felt an unfamiliar constriction in his throat, a tension in his hands that had never before trembled. The child's suffering was not abstract, not distant. It was immediate, undeniable, and it demanded a choice. He could walk away. He could leave, retreat into the comfort of his empire, dismiss the noise as irrelevant. That would have been easier. That would have been the man he had always been. But something stubborn, irrational, human, rooted him in place. His eyes did not leave the small, quivering figure. His shoulders, usually squared with impenetrable certainty, slumped imperceptibly. "Tell me," he said, his voice low and steady despite the quake inside him. "What's wrong with the child?" The words were simple, but they were a breach, a fracture in the man who had never asked for anything he could not buy or command. For the first time in decades, Thaddeus chose to step into a world he did not control, into a space where money, intimidation, and power were meaningless. He stayed, and in that act of attention, of refusal to turn away, the first seeds of change quietly took root. Thaddeus leaned against the wall outside the ICU, the sterile smell of antiseptic clinging to his suit, mingling unpleasantly with the faint, lingering scent of his own cologne. He watched the monitors through the glass, numbers flashing, alarms beeping softly, all mechanical rhythms that somehow failed to mask the fragility of life they tracked. Hawthorne lay small and still, tubes snaking from his tiny body, a network of helplessness that no amount of money or influence could untangle. He had faced death countless times, had orchestrated violence and fear with cold precision, but this delicate, unrelenting vulnerability mocked every tactic he had ever mastered. A nurse approached, her expression weary, rehearsed, but edged with the anxiety of someone accustomed to disappointment. "His heart is weak, lungs unstable. He's deteriorating faster than predicted. The doctors, they've tried everything they know." Her voice faltered under the weight of unspoken surrender. Thaddeus's eyes narrowed, a familiar storm rising within him. He was used to problems bending to his will, to obstacles crumbling under threats, persuasion, or sheer force of wealth. He had never met a challenge like this. He made the calls immediately, summoning specialists from every corner of the city. Surgeons known for brilliance, for miracles, for feats that defied the ordinary. One by one, they refused. Some shook their heads with polite regret, citing the child's fragile anatomy, the uniqueness of the condition. Others were blunt. Nothing more we can do. It's inoperable. Each refusal, each polite dismissal, was a hammer to his chest. Power meant nothing here. Money meant nothing here. Fear meant nothing here. He had nothing left to offer except attention and presence, and even that felt insufficient. Thaddeus stepped into the ICU briefly, just long enough to feel the hum of machines against his skin, to see the way Hawthorne's chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. The mother sat at the bedside, her face pale, streaked with tears, clutching her child's hand as though sheer will could keep him alive. He said nothing. Words were irrelevant, empty against the weight of this impossible reality. His hands, capable of violence without hesitation, itched with the uselessness of gentleness. The child's small eyes fluttered open, a brief spark of awareness, and Thaddeus felt a twinge of something he hadn't recognized in decades. Fear. Not for himself, but for the fragile life before him. Outside the ICU, he paced, his mind working furiously, strategies forming and dissolving in the cold hospital light. He could hire more doctors, buy more equipment, even pressure the hospital administration. And yet, with each attempt, the truth became undeniable. Some things were beyond influence, beyond domination. The stakes were no longer abstract. Hawthorne was not a case, not a problem to solve. He was a life, tiny and irreplaceable, and his death would mark the first defeat Thaddeus could not absorb, the first failure he could not mask with bravado or violence. For the first time, power was meaningless, and the vulnerability of another human being had pierced the armor he had spent decades perfecting. And so he stayed, pacing the corridor, watching, waiting, unwilling to walk away, despite knowing that nothing he had ever done could fix what needed fixing. Thaddeus returned the next day, and the day after that. Each visited a silent rebellion against the world he had always ruled with certainty. The hospital corridors, once alien and sterile, had become a stage where he observed the fragile rhythms of life he had spent decades ignoring. Hawthorne lay in the same bed, monitors blinking, alarms muted, and yet with each passing moment, the child's presence demanded a type of attention Thaddeus had never afforded anyone. He didn't speak at first, merely standing at the threshold, hands clasped behind his back, observing the small rise and fall of the boy's chest, the tentative reach of his fingers toward the mother's hand. It was during one of these quiet vigil moments that the child stirred, eyes opening to find the shadowed figure of a man who smelled of cigars and authority, but whose movements were now tentative, almost human. Hawthorne's gaze lingered, suspicion mingled with curiosity. Thaddeus felt an unfamiliar tug at his chest, a reminder that he had once been a child who had needed someone to stay, someone to care for. He lowered himself to sit beside the bed, the first concession to vulnerability he had made in decades. His presence was still commanding, yet softened by restraint, a careful balance he didn't fully understand. "You're Thaddeus, right?" the boy asked after a moment, voice small and tentative. His words were simple, but the honesty behind them pierced Thaddeus deeper than any threat or negotiation ever could. "I am," he replied, voice low, steady, though something quivered beneath it he did not yet name. "And you're Hawthorne." The child blinked, studying him with wide, unblinking eyes, searching for threat and finding none. Slowly, a small, uncertain smile broke across Hawthorne's face. It was brief, fragile, yet it struck Thaddeus with the force of revelation. This was not a moment of power. It was a moment of recognition, of connection. And in that recognition, something in him shifted. The walls he had built around himself, impenetrable and unyielding, showed their first cracks. Thaddeus began to linger, sitting in silence when the mother's tears fell freely, sometimes telling small stories to the boy in an awkward, halting way. He had never spoken to children before, not really, and each sentence felt foreign, clumsy, yet sincere. Hawthorne listened, sometimes responding with quiet questions, sometimes with nothing at all. But with each interaction, Thaddeus's presence became less of a shadow of authority and more of a tether, a small anchor in a world that refused to bend to his will. Outside the room, his associates noticed his absence, questions rising in their minds, suspicion edging toward concern. Yet Thaddeus remained unmoved, caught in a rhythm he could not abandon. For the first time, he was choosing to be present without command, without expectation of control. The child's faint smiles, the soft squeeze of a tiny hand, the brief acknowledgement of his attention, they were rewards unfamiliar and unsettling, but intoxicating in their simplicity. By the end of the week, the vigil had become a ritual. Thaddeus arrived, not as a king surveying his empire, but as a man quietly learning the weight of human fragility. The armor that had kept him untouchable was no longer whole, and though he could not yet name it, he felt the slow, unfamiliar pulse of something he had long denied: care. Thaddeus returned to his empire with a restlessness he hadn't known in years, the sterile quiet of the hospital replaced by the low hum of machines and whispered threats that defined his world. Yet, even amid the familiar rhythm of fear and control, his mind drifted back to Hawthorne's bedside. Orders given, deals closed, rivals reminded of their place. None of it felt urgent anymore. Each decision, each act of calculated ruthlessness, now came with a shadow, a persistent tug toward a boy whose fragile life had seeped into his consciousness. It was as though two worlds existed within him, one of iron and fire, the other of soft vulnerability he had long denied. The clash became undeniable the moment a messenger arrived with news from the hospital. Hawthorne had asked a question, a small, innocent query that seemed to dissolve the foundation beneath him. "Do you believe in angels?" the boy had whispered when Thaddeus bent close to explain the monitors and tubes. The question, so simple, so sincere, left Thaddeus staring at the sterile ceiling, chest tight, unsure whether to laugh, scoff, or flee. He hadn't believed in anything for decades, not chance, not fate, not God. Yet here was a child, looking at him with trust, demanding something he didn't know he possessed: honesty, and perhaps something softer, something human. Back at his office, the calls came in, urgent and unrelenting. A rival family had encroached on territory. One of his men had failed to follow orders. Law enforcement had begun sniffing too close. Thaddeus handled each problem with precision, yet the tension between worlds gnawed at him. During a meeting, he barked orders sharply, yet his mind wandered to the small hand that had gripped his own. He imagined the boy awake, searching for reassurance. He felt an unfamiliar unease, as though failing there would mean more than any defeat in his empire. Hawthorne's mother called once, voice trembling with exhaustion and gratitude, updating him on subtle improvements and setbacks. She didn't ask for help. He knew she could not, but he felt compelled to be there, even in absentia. The balance between his two lives was precarious. Nights became restless, sleep punctuated by visions of monitors, beeping alarms, and the boy's fragile chest rising and falling. He realized that power, wealth, and fear could no longer define him entirely. A new metric existed, one he did not yet understand. The innocence of Hawthorne's questions haunted him. "Why are people afraid of you? Do you ever cry? Will I get better?" Each one was a mirror, reflecting the man he had become against the man he might yet be. Thaddeus, accustomed to being untouchable, found himself unsettled, uncertain, exposed in ways he hadn't experienced in decades. He had ruled through domination, yet here he was, powerless before curiosity, trust, and hope. By the end of the day, he sat alone in his office, surrounded by ledgers and weapons, the city's night lights casting long shadows. The man who once believed control was everything now realized that attachment could fracture even the strongest armor. And in that quiet, tension-filled space, Thaddeus understood that he was divided, not by enemies, not by law, not by betrayal, but by a child whose innocence refused to be ignored. The night was silent in a way that pressed against Thaddeus's chest, heavier than any threat or gunfire he had ever faced. He arrived at St. Michael's Hospital to find a chaos he could neither control nor command. Alarms screamed from the ICU, lights flashing in sharp, urgent bursts. Nurses and doctors moved with mechanical precision, voices clipped with tension and exhaustion, but beneath their training lay the undeniable weight of dread. Hawthorne's small body lay pale and trembling, monitors screaming warnings that no amount of money, influence, or intimidation could silence. Thaddeus felt a cold, hollow emptiness as he stood by the glass, his hands curling into fists he did not need to unleash. He had faced death countless times, orchestrated it, delivered it, watched it play out in precise detail, but this fragile, innocent life slipping away left him gutted. His empire, his power, his reputation, all meaningless here. The boy's tiny chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven bursts, and each movement seemed to mock his control, his mastery over the world outside these walls. A nurse stepped forward briefly, her voice shaking despite years of experience. "We've stabilized him for now, but it won't hold long. Hours, maybe a day, that's all." The words landed like a hammer, shattering the careful composure he had maintained since entering this sterile world. Thaddeus wanted to speak, to demand, to fix this as he had fixed everything else, but the strategies and threats that governed his life were powerless against mortality. He could not buy time, bribe fate, or coerce life itself. He was nothing here, stripped of authority, reduced to a man watching helplessly. He tried to act, of course. He offered money, experimental treatments, begged administrators to push protocols, even threatened the hospital staff in quiet, simmering tones, but each attempt ended in polite refusal or grim acknowledgement. The systems that usually bowed before him were rigid, unyielding, indifferent to his will. For the first time, he understood the depth of his limitations. Control was a lie, power a temporary illusion, and life was fragile, unpredictable, ungovernable. The mother collapsed into a chair, her sobs muffled against the blankets covering Hawthorne. Thaddeus watched, feeling an unfamiliar tightness in his throat, a knot of helplessness twisting in his chest. He had been a witness to suffering before, but never had he been tethered to it, never had it gnawed at him from the inside out. The child's small hand twitched in the dim glow of the monitors, and Thaddeus bent closer instinctively, as if proximity alone could stave off the inevitable. Outside, the city continued in its indifferent chaos, unaware of the quiet devastation inside the hospital. Thaddeus sat alone in the waiting area, the cold fluorescent lights harsh on his face, hands pressed to his knees, mind racing and failing for the first time. He could not fix this. He could not command it. He could only watch, powerless, as the life he had come to care for hung by a thread, fragile and fleeting. And in that moment of raw confrontation, the truth settled over him like a weight he could not shake. He was mortal, and so was everything he had ever thought he controlled. Thaddeus stepped into the near-empty ICU, the harsh scent of antiseptic stinging his senses, blending with the faint smoke of the cigars he had left behind hours ago. The rhythmic beeping of monitors was deafening in the silence that had settled over the hospital. He approached Hawthorne's bed, his polished shoes silent against the linoleum, and for the first time, he felt the weight of a presence he could not dominate. The child's chest rose and fell unevenly, each shallow breath a reminder of the fragility he had spent a lifetime denying. He hesitated, hands gripping the edge of the bed, knuckles white. This was unfamiliar territory. He had never asked for anything, never bent, never admitted helplessness. Pride, control, and fear had been his weapons, but here, they were useless. His chest tightened as the enormity of the moment settled upon him. Hawthorne's small, fragile eyes flickered open, searching, trusting, and the sight cracked something deep within Thaddeus. He realized, with sudden, piercing clarity, that this life, this innocence, was beyond his reach, beyond his influence, beyond his power. The chapel door across the corridor glimmered faintly in the dim light, a suggestion rather than a command. Without thinking, without reasoning, Thaddeus moved. He sank to his knees on the cold, hard floor, the gesture foreign and uncomfortable. His hands shook, the tremor betraying the strength he had spent decades cultivating. Words felt impossible at first, fumbling, broken, unworthy. He swallowed hard, chest tight, and finally let them spill. I don't know if you're there. I don't know if you'd listen to someone like me. But this child, this innocent child, please. The words echoed in the quiet space, unpolished, raw, desperate. He tried to articulate what he wanted, what he needed, but language faltered, inadequate before the immensity of his surrender. There were no prayers memorized, no gestures of eloquence, only a man laid bare, stripped of pride, of control, of all the iron walls he had built to protect himself from weakness. He begged for mercy not for himself, but for a life that had never harmed anyone, for a small body that had endured more than it should have, for a future he could not guarantee. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, warmth he had long denied coursing through him, mingling with fear, regret, and hope. Each heartbeat was a drum in his chest, a reminder that he was powerless and that he had chosen, finally, to acknowledge it. His knees pressed into the cold tile, his forehead lowered in a gesture he didn't understand but felt instinctively. The silence answered him, vast and still. In that surrender, in that acknowledgement of his own limitations, Thaddeus discovered something he hadn't known he was seeking, humility, and, perhaps, the first thread of grace. He remained kneeling, silent now, listening to the faint beeps of monitors, feeling the fragile life beside him. For the first time in decades, he was entirely unarmed against the world. He had asked, he had hoped, and he had let go. Morning light spilled weakly through the tall hospital windows, painting the ICU in pale gold and silver. The machines hummed steadily now, alarms muted, as though the night had passed without incident. Thaddeus remained at Hawthorne's bedside, silent, kneeling once more beside the small figure that had demanded more of him than any empire ever could. He hadn't moved since the prayer. He hadn't dared hope, hadn't dared believe. Yet when he glanced at the monitors, a slow, cautious relief began to unfurl in his chest. Hawthorne's vitals, once erratic and weak, had stabilized. The child's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Thaddeus with a clarity that seemed miraculous in itself. For a moment, the room held its breath along with him, a fragile pause where fear and hope balanced in delicate tension. Hawthorne's lips curved into a faint smile, tentative but genuine, and reached a trembling hand toward Thaddeus. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible to an outside observer, yet for the man who had never bent, never yielded, it was a lifeline, a quiet confirmation that the world could still offer moments of grace. "You stayed," Hawthorne whispered, his voice barely audible. "I knew you'd stay." The words struck Thaddeus with unexpected force. They were not a declaration of victory or triumph, but of trust, innocence recognizing devotion without condition. In that gaze, he saw more than recovery. He saw the first reflection of the man he could become, a version of himself unbound from fear and control. The nurses exchanged glances, a mix of professional awe and cautious hope. Yet it was not their observations that mattered to Thaddeus. He felt a shift within him, subtle but undeniable. The rigid walls of pride and domination he had constructed over decades were softening. He realized that his power, his wealth, his reputation had never touched this kind of influence. To be present, to care without control, to witness and accept fragility. This was a strength he had never known. Hawthorne squeezed his hand lightly, a small, fragile anchor in a world that had often felt unforgiving. Thaddeus responded instinctively, fingers wrapping gently around the child's, a silent promise he could not yet articulate. The act required no dominance, no strategy, only presence. And for the first time, presence alone felt like enough. Outside the ICU, the city carried on, unaware of the quiet miracle unfolding in the sterile room. Yet within those walls, something profound had changed. Thaddeus was no longer simply the untouchable mafia boss, the man defined by fear and control. He was a man who had recognized his own limitations, who had dared to hope, who had been shaped by innocence and trust. The miracle was not only in Hawthorne's fragile recovery, but in the transformation taking root in the man who had prayed for the first time. He stayed by the bedside long after the vitals stabilized, silent, watching, listening, learning that care could be an act of courage, and that redemption, however small, could begin in the hum of machines, in a fragile smile, in the quiet connection between a child and a man who had never known tenderness. Weeks had passed, and the city had continued its restless pulse, indifferent to the transformations quietly taking shape within it. Thaddeus returned to the streets and offices of his empire, but he moved differently now, each step measured not with domination, but with purpose tempered by reflection. The men who once feared him for the sheer force of his will noticed the change immediately. Decisions were calmer, violence restrained, orders delivered with a patience that seemed almost foreign. Some questioned his judgment, some whispered of weakness, yet none could touch the quiet authority that now came from presence, not fear. Hawthorne's recovery had been slow but steady. The boy had grown stronger, laughter threading into the sterile hospital walls where silence had once reigned. Thaddeus visited often, sometimes unannounced, sometimes simply sitting in the small chair beside the bed, hand resting lightly on the boy's. There were no grand speeches, no declarations of guardianship, only attention, patience, and care. Hawthorne's mother, once exhausted and weary, now allowed herself moments of relief, sharing news, small triumphs, even laughter. And in return, Thaddeus listened, absorbing not strategy or power, but the fragile, invaluable threads of human connection he had long denied himself. The consequences of his transformation were unavoidable. Rivals tested boundaries he no longer enforced. With the same ferocity, law enforcement probed weaknesses he had once been ruthless in hiding. Some of his own men resisted the shift, bristling at the absence of fear as currency. Yet Thaddeus met each challenge with a new kind of resolve, one not built on intimidation, but on clarity and intentionality. Power remained, but it was wielded differently, carefully, judiciously, a means to protect rather than destroy. In moments of quiet, he found himself reflecting on the prayer that had broken him open, the small act of surrender that had reshaped the man he thought he could never change. The lessons were simple yet profound. Strength could coexist with humility. Influence could be measured not by terror, but by trust. Redemption was not a single act, but an ongoing choice. Each day he made these choices. He felt the weight of his past, yes, but also the exhilarating, terrifying freedom of a future he had not dictated, could not control, yet could nurture. One afternoon, he stood outside the hospital, watching Hawthorne run down the corridor, laughing, the child's joy echoing in his chest. The boy paused, turning toward him, eyes bright with recognition, trust, and something resembling love. Thaddeus smiled faintly, a gesture he had not allowed himself for decades. For the first time, he did not feel the need to hide, to dominate, to command. He was present, human, and unafraid of what lay ahead. The empire he had built remained, though altered. The man who had once ruled through fear now ruled through example, tempered by the lessons of fragility and grace. He had faced consequences, loss, doubt, the relentless pressure of a world unwilling to pause, but he had also discovered a life beyond power, beyond control. And as he watched Hawthorne disappear down the hallway, Thaddeus understood, finally and fully, that he was no longer the man who had never blinked. He was reborn.